What is holding up a deal with Canada from your perspective?
It's not so much holding up. I think we have different concepts. I have a tariff concept, and Mark has a different concept, which is something that some people like. But we're going to see if we can get to the bottom of it today.
An optimistic tone as trade talks got underway in the Rocky Mountains this morning. Prime Minister Mark Carney met one-on-one with U.S. President Donald Trump, who says he wants to work out a trade deal with Canada. Hi there, this is Power in Politics. I'm David Cochrane, live today from Banff, Alberta, with special coverage of the G7 summit. Canadian officials say they had a good meeting with U.S. counterparts, but there's still no final agreement. Instead, positive words about progress and acceleration, with the promise of more meetings later this week to try to settle this costly tariff standoff.
We feel a sense of acceleration in the discussions in the last couple of weeks, and that is a very good thing.
So we think we've made progress, and we've agreed to have a further meeting later this week.
The Canada-U.S. issue is just one storyline at a summit filled with them, as the Prime Minister tries to bring the world together as conflict and war threatens to tear it apart.
We're gathering at one of those turning points in history. I think we all recognize that turning point where the world looks to this table for leadership.
The G7 leaders meet as tensions rise in the Middle East, and a global trade war puts world economies at risk.
I'm a tariff person. I've always been a tariff. It's simple, it's easy, it's precise, and it just goes very quickly.
The U.S. president says his primary focus of this meeting is trade with Canada. Can the countries come to terms with their differences over tariffs? Canada's ambassador to the United States, Kirsten Hillman, is standing by. We have a lot to get to as Power in Politics starts right now. Today's in-person meeting between Mark Carney and President Donald Trump was the second since Carney became Prime Minister. Canadian officials say they've agreed to accelerate negotiations toward a trade deal and that they're already setting up another meeting for later this week. So, what happened between the leaders today? Kirsten Hillman is Canada's ambassador to the United States, and she joins me now. Ambassador, thank you so much for squeezing us in on a busy day. I'm hoping you can provide a few more details about where things have gone. You said today you have felt a sense of acceleration in these talks, but you're in the middle of discussions, not at the end of discussions. Have the two countries moved appreciably closer to getting a deal here?
Well, I think that every time we meet, we move a little bit closer. And I know that's probably not terribly satisfactory when we're trying to explain to Canadians the steps towards a date and be able to say by date certain we think we're going to be there. Unfortunately, I'm not able to, be that precise with you. But what I can say is we had a good meeting. So the Prime Minister and the President had a private meeting before the rest of the delegation came in. Then the delegation came in. We spent an awful lot of time. We talked about other things, but we spent a lot of time talking about trade and tariffs and economic partnership and making sure that we are, working in a way that supports both of our economies. And we were asked by the leaders to try to accelerate the pace of our discussions. So that I think is really good. It led to immediately a meeting just very shortly thereafter with Ambassador Greer and Minister LeBon and I and a few others. And that's a very positive thing. And we're going to meet again before the end of the week. So that is an acceleration. Right. I think we're trying to get to the right place. It's very hard to quantify for your viewers in sort of real terms because there's a lot under discussion.
Right, and look, in every negotiation, nothing is done until everything is done, especially in a conversation like this. But I just wonder about a comment the President made after his meeting with the Prime Minister this morning. He said a deal is achievable within days or weeks. Does Canada share the President's optimism there on that timeline?
Look, I hope so. It would be great. If we could have a deal within days or weeks, then that would be fantastic. And I think based on the way in which our economies are intertwined, based upon the value proposition that we pose for the U.S., in terms of the objectives that it has for its country, for its economy, it is doable. But they have to also, put the Canadian side back into a place where we are not being harmed by their tariff policy, where we have some stability and certainty for the future, as much as that is possible in this very complicated global world that we're in. So I hope so. That will require a fairly hearty discussion on both sides of the table. But it's great to hear that the president thinks so, and I think that's a really important message for his team as well.
I wonder if you can help me understand something the president said today, and I know you're limited in what details you can share, Ambassador, but he said he's a tariff person. He said the Prime Minister has something that's more complex. I mean, more complex, is that simply getting back to like a trade agreement, which is obviously a more complex thing than across-the-board tariffs? Is that what we're talking about here in terms of the two different approaches? Help us understand that if you can.
Yeah, and there is really only a certain level of detail I can get into. I think the best way to maybe explain as much as I can is that the president feels that tariffs are the best tool for a variety of economic objectives that he has, for creating barriers into the United States to encourage domestic production, for raising revenues for some of the economic policies, including tax cuts and other things that he is seeking to achieve for his own economy, and to sort of leverage policy changes in other countries. And so he likes tariffs. He feels that they are very effective. He's always been a strong tariff proponent. He was when he was first in office, when we were renegotiating the NAFTA, and he continues to have that perspective. Canada is a country that, understands the values of tariffs, but we are also, at our core, a free trading nation. We believe that the Canadian economy is stronger, more robust, more resilient when we have, broad partnerships, secure supply chains, and in strategic areas, self-sufficiency and self-assurance, but also that working with partners makes us more competitive. So and in broad strokes, I think that that's sort of the philosophical difference. But I think our task is to find a path to achieve the ultimate goals of both of our countries, despite maybe these differences in preferences with respect to policy tools. And we'll see if we can do it. Okay. I believe that, there's work to be done that we can get done.
Right. Well, and look, you, the Prime Minister, Minister LeBlanc, have all made it very clear the goal is a reset tariffs back to where they were before all of this, to get the tariffs off the table. But the President said he still believes in them, that he's a tariff person. So is there a world where Canada and the U.S. can get a deal that gets rid of the tariffs on us and President Trump can still have his tariffs with other countries? I mean, is that the landing point here as you maybe see it?
Look, our goal is to get the tariffs off for Canada. We will be pushing to get the tariffs off for Canada. We are going to try and find a path with the U.S. so that we can get to that place. I am not, I don't think that we're interested in really talking about another perspective. We understand that the tariffs are a policy that the president finds useful and that he may well find effective with other countries. We are working very, very hard to make the case that using those tariffs with us is not going to be as productive for the goals that he has than some other choices and avenues that we might be able to pursue.
And look, Ambassador, maybe this treads into you can't discuss what was said in the room, but do you think based on today and the acceleration that you're feeling and the being told to accelerate talks, as Minister LeBlanc described it, do you think you're on a path where you can get there, that there can be a world where a president who likes tariffs agrees not to put tariffs on Canada?
I sure hope so. I think we have all the arguments and all the data and all of the support, both in Canada and the U.S., that should help us get there. Whether we will get there or not, that remains to be seen. But I believe that we have an excellent case to make, and I'm looking to all Canadians, private sector, government at all levels across the country, to help us continue making that case.
And are you getting that sense of compromise and willingness from across the table? I mean, are you getting a sense that the Americans are willing to move on that as these talks go on?
I'll get back to you on that one.
Okay. All right. Look, Ambassador, I know time is tight, but you're going to be meeting with Jameson Greer, the USTR, and others later this week, the U.S. Trade Representative. Are those talks going to be in Washington? I mean, what do you have? What clarity do you have at this point on what the next steps?
We're still working that out. We're working that out. We're going to meet later this week again. We had a good meeting again today. We may have some, more exchanges and conversations before we meet. So the exact form of that is not yet decided. We're kind of trying to work that out.
Okay, Ambassador Kirsten Hillman, I know you got to run. Thank you for making time for us on a busy day like today.
All right. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Okay, so those trade talks between Canada and the United States, those were happening. They happened on the sidelines, as they say, of the G7 summit. The CBC's Ashley Burke is with me here in Banff, Alberta. She was in Kananaskis at that summit earlier today when the meeting took place. So, Ashley, the world leaders are trying to find consensus on a lot of things, Canada-U.S. trade being one of them. There are a lot of other issues at the table here, and their hints consensus is going to be very difficult to get.
Yeah, exactly, David. Before the summit even started this morning, media went into the room where Mark Carney and Donald Trump had just met one-on-one. And with the cameras rolling, Trump decided to bring up the fact that Russia was kicked out of the G7 more than a decade ago. And he cast blame at Carney's predecessor, Justin Trudeau, wrongly. He was not the prime minister at the time. It was Stephen Harper, and brought up the fact that he shouldn't have been kicked out, or there wouldn't be a war in Ukraine in the first place. And you could see when you watch that tape, Carney didn't say anything, he didn't flinch, but you could tell as that scrum went on that he wanted it to wrap up. He wanted it to be brief. And within 8 minutes, he shut it down and said, look, it's time for media to go, and everyone was escorted out of that room. And this is something that Trump has brought up before, years ago when Canada hosted the G7, this idea of Russia coming back into the mix and being part of the summit. And the leaders back then, they shut it down. They said, this is not a good idea. So him bringing it up today, trying to reinsert it back into the conversation, just shows how difficult it might be to reach a consensus on some of the things they're going to be talking about.
Obviously there's so much spotlight on Trump and certainly the meeting between Prime Minister Carney and the president, but they all sat down as a group, as a much larger group for closed door meetings today. What do we know about what they were talking about and what they're hoping to achieve? Yeah,
Mark Carney is trying to make this about more than its biggest personality here, which is Donald Trump, right? They have an agenda here. He's hosting for the first time. This is a chance for him to really set the agenda in a way that works for Canada as well. And he's got a whole bunch of things on the agenda that he wants to talk about. There are a series of sessions today, everything from keeping communities safe to keep protecting the world to the economic outlook. All of those things are talking about. It's all happening behind closed doors. And you've got calls for them on the issue of the rising tension between Iran and Israel to take action, to use this as an opportunity to call for de-escalation. We've heard that there is a communique that they are working on to put out along those lines, but Trump has made it very clear he's not going to sign on to that. So, what do you do? How do you reach a consensus on issues like that? We heard Mark Carney today in his opening statements talk about some of the things where they think that they can cooperate on, things like critical minerals, artificial intelligence, and he's calling for them to come together on some of those things. So far, no sign of any joint communiques today, but that really is his focus, to come out with some, what he calls, actionable items.
Right, and we'll get the formal press conference from Mark Carney a little over 24 hours from now. Okay, Ashley, thanks so much. This is CBC's Ashley Burke here in Banff. Okay, we're going to have, obviously, more coverage of the G7 summit throughout the program. This hour, the Power Panel is here to interpret today's remarks from President Trump. Good luck with that. And they're also going to talk about the weight of this moment as the world leaders gather. But first, we turn to another diplomatic front as 5 Canadian premiers are in Boston with their own mission to fight Trump's tariffs. We'll find out how their meetings went today with northeastern state governors. That's coming up next. While G7 leaders gather here in Alberta, some of Canada's premiers are in Boston, meeting with northeastern state governors. They're there to discuss the impacts of Donald Trump's tariffs and to forge new economic ties.
Everyone around this table is trying to deal with a situation that was thrust upon us. Nobody here created this situation. It's created this divide between our countries, and Canadians, you know, when they hear the talk of the 51st state stuff, we're pretty ticked off about that. It kind of makes us really upset. So, but when we get together and talk about what's possible and how do we move forward, that's the stuff that we should focus on.
The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick joins us now from Boston. Megan, I don't know if ticked off was the word Premier Houston wanted to use there, but what else did you hear from the premiers and the governors at this meeting?
Yeah, so they had a closed-door meeting this morning, and then they held this roundtable discussion where we heard some of those comments. And it was interesting to hear from the U.S. governors, David. They were talking about the impact of the tariffs on their respective jurisdictions and the sectors in their states that are being impacted. And quite a few of them were talking about their tourism industry. So these were states like Massachusetts and Maine and Vermont that heavily rely on Canadian tourists. And as we know, some Canadians are choosing not to travel to the United States right now, and the governors were talking about how much that's hitting them, and they were saying they want to try and get the message across to Canadians through our premiers, through meetings like these, that they don't share the rhetoric of Donald Trump when he talks about the 51st state. They don't agree with his trade policies that are hurting Canadian sectors, and so they're trying to get the message out that they want Canadians to come back. They are welcome, so they were trying to get that message across, but from the Canadian premiers, they were saying they're encouraging Canadians to spend their vacation dollars in Canada. And they said they need Americans to speak up loudly in opposition to these tariffs and get the message across to President Trump that they're hurting their economy and putting their jobs at risk. So they were talking about the impact. They also talked quite a bit about the energy sector as well. We were hearing a lot from the U.S. governors about how much they rely on these Canadian provinces that were at the meeting for energy products. So they were talking about the impact, and then they were talking about what to do about these tariffs. And from them, David, during that part of the meeting, they really were kind of acknowledging there's only so much they can do. And that's where Tim Houston was making those comments about how there's a lot out of their control. So what they want to try and do is focus on what's within their control and where they have sort of common ground, shared interests. But we heard similar comments from New York's governor, for example, Kathy Hochul, who was saying, you know, these states and these provinces, they need to just sort of go on their own and forge these trade relationships, especially when it comes to energy, she said, because she said DC is not looking out for them. So we heard them talk about how they can work together, how they want to try and maintain these relationships, which of course are deep and long, so that when this trade war is over, they can, you know, hit the ground running again and build back the trade relationships that are fractured right now. And they also said, again, they know, you know, the group of them meeting today isn't necessarily going to change the mind of President Trump in terms of his trade policies. So they are watching closely, they said, what's happening, where you guys are in at the G7. And hoping for something positive to come out of that meeting with Carney, with Trump, with the other world leaders to try and get a resolution to this trade war. As Premier Doug Ford was putting it, David, he said his hope is, well, he said, let's get a deal. So they're meeting here today. They partly just did this as a relationship building exercise. They like having these face-to-face meetings, but really, they're keeping a close eye on what's going on north of the border at the G7 and hoping that some positive results come out of it.
Okay, Megan, thanks very much. This is CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick in Boston. Well, after that meeting in Boston, the governors spoke of the importance of their relationship with Canada.
I don't want any more rhetoric, tariffs, or anything that's going to set our relationship further back than it already has been. Now it's time to start healing.
We need each other in order to survive in the future.
This dialogue today has been very eye-opening for me. And what's been said from our colleagues here in Canada, we need to listen to. This rhetoric that is going on that creates division needs to stop.
Well, one of the premiers who was part of the talks with those governors was the Premier of New Brunswick, Susan Holt, and I spoke with Premier Holt earlier this afternoon, right after that meeting ended. Premier, it's good to see you again. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me, David.
Okay, so full disclosure to the audience, as we're having this conversation, we're still a little bit unclear what results came out of the president's meeting with the prime minister. So we want to just acknowledge that. But let's talk about your meetings there in Boston. Obviously, a lobbying relationship with the closest states geographically and economically to the eastern Canadian provinces. What do you think you were able to accomplish in these meetings with the governors today?
Well, we were really here to talk about two things. We were talking about tourism and we're talking about energy. On the tourism front, it's clear how much of a negative impact certainly the New England states are feeling from the lack of Canadian visitors. And on the energy front, it's clear how much opportunity there is for us to continue to build connections and integrate our energy solutions for more resiliency and better energy security. But we were all unanimous on the fact that we are waiting to see what's happening at the G7 and hoping to see a deal get done.
They must be feeling the tourism hit quite severely. Was that their message there? The stories you read out of American media, all throughout the New England states in particular, is that Canadians just aren't going, and a lot of seasonal industries are struggling because of it.
Yeah, each governor seemed to have their own story of the size of the impact, but we heard things like 60%, a 60% drop in bookings at state parks in Vermont. In New York, 40% drop in hotel stays, 36% drop in credit card charges for retail and hospitality in that state. And so a drop in air travel, a drop in bookings in ways that are meaning that people are getting laid off and it's hurting their tourism industry.
How is that affecting the bilateral relationships or the premier to governor relationships there, Premier Holt? Because obviously, you're not putting American liquor on shelves in a lot of provinces. You're telling people to travel in Canada and not go to the U.S. And it's not their fault. A lot of these governors are Democrats who aren't in support of what the president is doing. I mean, how is that affecting things on that one-to-one basis?
Yeah, it was a pretty frank conversation because we agree. We know that it's not the governor of New Hampshire or the governor of Vermont or the governor of Maine's fault, but they're asking us to go and encourage New Brunswickers to do some tourism in the U.S. and I can't ask New Brunswickers to do that. I'm asking New Brunswickers to stay home, to visit the Maritimes, to keep their dollars in Canada until such a time as the person ultimately responsible for the American economy realizes the damage that he's causing to Americans. And so I feel for them. Look, as a province who receives a significant amount of investment in tourism from Americans and others, I know what a hit like 60% of your bookings can bring, but I'm not at a point where I can encourage New Brunswickers to cross that border until their president takes these taxes off of our economy.
So we have this situation, and yet we have the governor of Massachusetts, Maura Healey, saying one of the messages being sent by today's meeting was that the Northeast is open for business. Is that the case, given everything that's happened? I mean, how do you think that message is being received?
Well, that's one thing that we've heard unanimously. Look, the relationship between the northeastern U.S. and eastern Canada goes back centuries, right? We talked about the relationship Boston to Halifax after the explosion. We talked about how we helped each other out through things like the War of 1812, through a Canadian embassy that sheltered and protected American diplomats during the Iran affair. We have been close friends and trading partners for decades and decades and decades. And so the relationship is going to continue. And New England assured us that they value Canadians, that they respect us and our sovereignty. And we assured them that this is not personal, that we have lots of friends and family here in Boston and Massachusetts and Maine and Vermont and you name it. But the Canadians are mad. And we're doing what we can to send the kind of economic messages we can to their leadership.
So obviously there is a consensus there that you want things to get back to normal, but things can't get back to normal until the Prime Minister Carney and President Trump form some sort of a conclusion to all of this. And as important as those meetings in Boston are, about an hour that way behind me in Kananaskis, that's where the real meeting is happening to sort of settle this. And we saw some positive language from the president, in the limited access that in the lead up to that meeting, and Prime Minister Carney was asked by a member of the media how it went, and he said fantastic. But again, we don't yet know the total outcome. So have you and the other premiers heard anything in Boston, and what's your sense of what those signals at least tell us on where this might be going?
Well, I haven't checked my texts in the last half hour or so because we've been at this great luncheon with some Massachusetts business leaders. But if Prime Minister Carney said it was fantastic, he's not a man prone to exaggeration. So I'm optimistic that what we all want here, the Eastern Canadian premiers and the governors, we want to see a deal done that gets tariffs removed and bring us back to the kind of free and open trade that is going to help us continue to grow our economies and our opportunities for Canadians and Americans alike.
Are you worried about what happens, Premier, if they leave the G7 without significant progress on resolving these disputes? Because the retaliatory tariffs on steel and aluminum and the others that have been held sort of in reserve as they work through this process, they're still there. And the Prime Minister has suggested there's only so long they can wait before they have to hit back. I mean, you're worried about what happens if the world leaders leave here and Donald Trump and Mark Carney don't have an agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. The longer this goes on, the more uncertainty. There's been a chilling effect on certainly the economy in New Brunswick since last November, where hiring decisions, investment decisions, expansion decisions have been put on pause. And we just heard the same from folks here at the New England Business Council and the Boston Chamber of Commerce that things have frozen. People are anticipating a recession. We need to resolve this as fast as possible. So if we don't have a deal done today, then I hope it's tomorrow.
Susan Holt, Premier of New Brunswick, we always appreciate the time. And when you go through your texts, if there's one from Mark Carney saying we've got a deal, let us know. We'll have you back on right away.
I'll go and check my phone here shortly. Thanks, David.
Okay, there is no text saying there's a deal because the trade talks continue between Canada and the U.S., and they got underway this morning at the G7 summit.
Canada is arguing for removal of tariffs. We should have no tariffs on Canadian exports to the United States. That is our position.
I'm a tariff person. I've always been a tariff. It's simple, it's easy, it's precise.
So how do you convince a tariff person who happens to be president to drop tariffs? Up next, the Power Panel on their takeaways from day one of the G7 summit. Okay, that is a live shot of the view we have here from the Power and Politics set in beautiful Banff, Alberta. Pretty stunning setting for the annual summit of the G7 leaders. It is definitely in the running to be one of the most beautiful G7 summits in recent years. It could also be one of the most consequential G7 summits in recent years, as Prime Minister Mark Carney is hosting world leaders this week as the world order undergoes a seismic shift. And the key architect of some of that is U.S. President Donald Trump. That's why all eyes were on the sidelines of the summit today as Prime Minister Carney and President Trump met one-on-one.
Mr. President, welcome to Canada.
Thank you very much.
It's a great honor. Happy birthday. A few days short.
A little bit.
A few days short, but didn't have a chance to see you on the day. This marks the 50th birthday of the G7, and the G7 is nothing without U.S. leadership, and your personal leadership of the United States.
I appreciate it, and we've developed a very good relationship, and we're going to be talking about trade and many other things. I think we have different concepts. I have a tariff concept, and Mark has a different concept, which is something that some people like. But we're going to see if we can get to the bottom of it today. I'm a tariff person. I've always been a tariff. It's simple, it's easy, it's precise, and it just goes very quickly. And I think Mark has a more complex idea, but also very good. So we're going to look at both, and we're going to see what we're going to come out with something, hopefully.
Okay, that was the bit of the meeting that was for public consumption. We got a better idea of how those talks went in private when Canada's ambassador to the United States, Kirsten Hillman, briefed reporters this afternoon.
We have a president who is very convinced of the policy that he has around tariffs in order to achieve some of his policy goals. We are very convinced that applying that policy to Canada is actually detrimental to his overall goals, and we are trying to get there with him and his officials so that they understand our perspective. We feel a sense of acceleration in the discussions in the last couple of weeks, and that is a very good thing.
Okay, it's time to bring in the power panel to talk about all of this. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Brad Levine is a former national campaign director for the NDP. And in Ottawa, in the studio, Vandana Cotter was an advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and Rob Russo is the Canada correspondent for The Economist. It's good to see you all. Hello from beautiful Banff. Lisa, you have come out of rooms as a cabinet minister with similar, I guess, instructions not to spill the beans as Dominic LeBlanc and Kirsten Hillman had today. What do we take from what we heard from the Prime Minister, from the President, and later from the Ambassador and the Minister?
I was watching the Prime Minister's body language, and I'm struck by the fact that it appeared that when President Trump mentioned something about how Canada has another way of looking at it or a larger concept, I swear I thought I saw the Prime Minister kind of wink to somebody off camera.
He did. He did wink. No, he winked at the camera. I don't know if it was off camera. It was definitely a wink.
And he kind of goes up on his tiptoes when he is, he has something that he knows that nobody else knows. You'll see him do a little rock. And the other thing that I noticed was he had kind of like a Cheshire grin on at the very end when the president said that we may be getting there. So I may be just reading into all of this, but I think that there possibly is good news coming for Canada, or at least good news for the government in that they may have something to announce. I don't know whether or not the deal is going to be good for Canada. That's going to be up to the different sectors in the provinces to determine if it's a good deal or not. But it seems as if they may end up having an announcement coming out of this. And if it is, good on them.
Well, you know, Brad, there was no announcement out of it today, but, you know, the vibe, for lack of a better word, between the president and the prime minister, very good, first name basis, you know, with the president calling him Mark and no derogatory stuff. The ambassador and Dom LeBlanc said that they have been told to accelerate things, and they're going to meet later this week with the trade representative, Jameson Greer. So there's progress. We just don't know if there's progress on the material negotiations and the issues of play.
Yeah, I think that secondary meeting later in the week is significant.
only because folks don't meet if there's nothing to talk about. And, the fact that there's many things on the table, it takes more time than they have, off to the side at a G7. So I think that's that's my first takeaway, is that there's an agreement to continue the conversation. Now, as to what, who knows? The acceleration is a positive thing. We wouldn't have heard that term unless there was some progress to accelerate. But what I found interesting is to what possibly could be agreed upon. I mean, this is a country that has broken its trade deal that the president himself signed by imposing these tariffs to begin with. But I found that your interview with the ambassador at the top of the show, very interesting. And she obviously could not say the things that you were asking her, and you were prefacing it with, I know you can't tell me. But she was very, very clear, and I think this was a bit of a hint, at least I took it away as a hint, where she said, we have to understand the U.S. administration's policy objectives. And she listed 3. One was the desire to onshore U.S. jobs. The second was revenue for the U.S. Treasury. And third was policy changes within the tariffed countries themselves. And I found that to be very interesting. Could that be the menu for what could possibly lead to a complex thing that President Trump even himself mentioned, a bit more complex than the blunt instrument of tariffs? Could those elements be part of something that could inevitably lead to an agreement within the coming days or weeks?
Vandana, Brad's got a point there, but there's also, when you look at those 3, the warning to the U.S. is if you keep doing this, you're actually going to lose U.S. jobs, which means you're not going to get the revenue from tariffs. And some of the policy changes are, we're going to deepen defense partnerships and procurement with Europe and Asia and other things, and not with the United States, right? So I guess these are the areas of settlement one way or another, either as leverage points or as possible, I don't want to say concession points, but negotiation points. What are your thoughts on everything we heard today?
Yeah, I think he definitely is using those points for leverage. I think he also is seeing that, politically speaking, the impact of his decisions on the U.S. economy. We saw Premier Holt talk about how Canadians are angry. And even just yesterday, I was at a grocery store and I heard a woman say, oh, blueberries from U.S., I'm not taking this. So Canadians are still rallying behind that. I heard from Susan Holt also that the meeting with the governors, also they're feeling the pressure. And I saw Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan saying the economy could be deteriorating. So I think Donald Trump is also feeling a lot of pressure. So I feel like that also helps with him in wanting to get a deal. It sounded like he was very positive about it. It sounded like he wanted something today or sometime this week. But I do think if we see something that comes out, if not this time, but very shortly afterwards.
Rob, what's your takeaway from what we saw and heard today?
Well, I too, like Brad, was struck by the words that the Canadian side was trying to do something, to offer something to President Trump that would advance his policy goals. I'm struck by the difference in Mr. Trump's tone from when they first met in a bilateral in the White House. I think it was the 6th of May. He was asked in the Oval Office, is there anything that Prime Minister Carney could say to you that would get you to drop tariffs? And he said, no, not at all, not a chance. Today, he said, well, Prime Minister Carney's got something that's more complex, not necessarily a bad thing, it could be a good thing, is the way he put it. He's willing to consider it. That's a significant change in tone, I would say, for a man who seems intent to tithe anybody who wants to access what is still the most lucrative conservative or consumer market in the world.
Mm-hmm. So, Lisa, what do we draw from that? Because, the last G7, the Canada hosted was in Charlevoix. And we all know how that went. And increasingly, as the Donald Trump G7s happened during his first term, they got more and more difficult to manage for the host country. The last one he went to was in France in 2019, I believe, where they just essentially decided, much like this one, no communique, let's just put out a statement from the chair on the common points. But things were getting worse with Canada during the first term as the years went on. Things seem to be getting better with Canada, at least rhetorically, and in that one-on-one relationship, even as steel and aluminum tariffs have doubled, right? The policy's gone in the wrong way, but the personality thing has gone in the right way. I don't know how to assess a dynamic like that.
Maybe, but maybe, David, that this is just a moment in time where the president has had a really rough week, and he just doesn't want to pick any more fights right now. So he is being as demure as Mr. Trump gets. I'll note the fact that he's wearing a Canada-US pin on his lapel, which I find really interesting. I've not seen that before coming from somebody that official. I think he may just not want to have a fight right now. Maybe he's just at the G7 and wants to skate through as much as he can. I'm hoping that it's a signal that we have a deal, but it could equally be the fact that he just has no fight in him right now, doesn't want to put up resistance, and we have to wait for another shoe to drop.
You know, Yvonne, I want to circle back to you on that PIN issue, because we're told by the Prime Minister's office, not a PIN issue, but just to explain to people, this is not something that Canada handed out as the host nation to the countries. This is something Donald Trump just showed up with, and they were as surprised, I think, as everybody to see it. Now, it is weird because of the specific nature of this president and also the level of discipline in this Prime Minister's office that we're kind of interpreting body language of the Prime Minister, the subtext of the spoken word by the ambassador and the president. But it does tell us there are visible signs of progress, it seems, without an actual conclusion and without knowing the details of where we're headed on this.
Yeah, and like some of the observations I had from that bilateral is I think Mark Carney has figured out how to connect with Donald Trump, and he's had his career has been on the international perch for a long time, so I'm sure he's dealt with a number of personalities similar to Donald Trump over his career. I also think Donald Trump is someone who wants to be liked. President Trump wants to be liked, he likes to be admired, so if he's going to a place where he feels like he admires Mr. Carney, he's friends with people like the King of England, I think a number of these leaders already have friendships with him or relationships with him. So I feel like President Trump will want to be a part of that, actually. I don't think he wants to be disliked. I think he wants to govern from a place of power and strength and show strength to the U.S. He has to do that politically for his own base as well. But I do think he'll want to be a part of all this, and he wouldn't want to be the one who's the outlier when everyone else is coming together and forming new alliances.
Okay, so Brad, a counterpoint on the positivity here. There was a lot of energy put into trying to get something, hopefully, by the G7. And here we are at the G7, and there's going to be more meetings after the G7. It didn't get done in time. It didn't get done today. I'm not saying it's a catastrophe and a disaster. But if you have this sort of inflection point of the face-to-face meeting on Canadian soil as a target for a deal and you don't get it, should you be optimistic that it all comes together in the follow-up in 72 to 96 hours?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if, like, universally we should have been applying all this pressure to get a whole bunch of things done just because the G7 was on this date at this time. So I don't think that the domestic audiences of the leaders are going to be either, you know, like, I think people, especially workers that are affected by these tariffs, if there is relief coming in the coming days and weeks, they're not going to look back and say that would have been nicer to be announced in Alberta during the G7. So, you know, you take the win when you can get it. And these are complicated matters. And listen, you got to take a look at the calendar here. I mean, you know, 3 months ago, Carney was, at Brookfield, and now he's hosting the G7 as Prime Minister of Canada. So I think that the level of optimism, the speed with which things are being accelerated is fairly good. Just quickly on the point of Trump and the difference of tone. Like, I think in the first term, I think he was learning on the job of what the power of the presidency was, and then when he came back after a 4-year break, I think he had a much different agenda as to how he would use the powers at his disposal to leverage things. And, you know, he came out very strong in the opening hours of being president, even before he took the oath, versus, I think, in the first term, he was a lot slower and kind of learning. And I think he's learning a lot, and he's implementing a lot of this. But the tremendous amount of leverage. Now, on the world, he's got all these tariffs. Canada still, well, the tariffs are still too high on Canada. They are the lowest, if not among the lowest, that he's already applied. To get a deal for Canada would then signal for him, he's promised his country a whole bunch of deals. He's got no deals yet. He's actually, I think, fairly hungry for a deal. And if he can get a good deal with Canada that meets these policy objectives that the ambassador hinted at the outset of the show, I think that sets him up for success when he negotiates with the rest of the world, because he's taken on the rest of the world, unlike the first term where he just picked selectively his tariff nation victims.
He's got to deal with the
Brad,
UK,
sometime
though.
in the last 20... Yeah, I was just going to say, sometime in the last 20, 30 minutes, the President and Prime Minister Keir Starmer of the United Kingdom, they signed something. I think it's the cementing or formalizing of essentially the term sheet they reached earlier in the year, but it also doesn't include steel and aluminum tariffs, so it's unclear how far-reaching it goes. Rob, on this, like, is Brad right that it's unfair to put too much pressure on this particular summit and this particular date to get everything done just because the G7 is happening? Or, you know, is there a little bit of a downside to not getting it done here? Because, you know, we saw the steel sector all last week and the week before saying we got to move fast on counter tariffs. You got to do things to protect the industry because people are losing jobs every day. We don't do something about the 50% tariff here.
Yes. I think part of the argument that Canada made to the United States was, look, if you come here and we've got a deal, we can hold it aloft like a trophy, and we can show the rest of the world that we can, the United States can make mutually beneficial deals with its allies, rather than hammering them and pummeling them with hobbling tariffs. That being said, you know, the entire notion of the G7 this year is a very, very modest one. When I asked a couple of other G7 ambassadors what success would look like, it would be if we had a coherent and unified G7 next year. So in other words, we got to get through this. They're an unhappy family, squabbling with each other. We have a Canadian Prime Minister who is determined to move away from the United States with resolve and with speed. So I would say that, you know, you look at the agenda. The agenda is energy security, AI, disinformation, global economic outlook. You know, this is not exactly going to provoke Donald Trump. It's kind of meant to mollify him and keep this thing alive and going for another year. Also a demonstration, when you look at what's happening in the Middle East, of the fact that the United States remains really the only superpower in that room, the only country that can resolve, perhaps, or determine the outcome of what happens in the Middle East, as well as what's happening in Ukraine as well. So modest ambitions, I think, for this summit.
Yeah, I had a similar conversation with the G7 diplomat who said we're hoping for a strong, united position on Ukraine and then just hold the family together. You know, unity coming out of the G7, because the president's presence can be disruptive on those things. So you're not wrong there, Rob. Okay, a quick break. But up next today, we learned when Pierre Poilievre's leadership will be put to a vote, and we learned what he's doing to try to rally Conservatives behind him. The Power Panel turns to that story next. Pierre Poilievre has 7 months to convince Conservatives he should stay on as party leader. As sources tell CBC News that Poilievre will face a mandatory leadership review at the party's national convention in January. In the meantime, Poilievre appears to be taking stock of his election loss. And according to reporting in the Hill Times, Poilievre is reaching out to unsuccessful Conservative candidates for feedback. And those Conservatives described it as Poilievre doing a post-mortem himself. That's the next topic for the Power Panel with Lisa Raitt, Brad Levine, Vandana Cotter, and Rob Russo. Look, I do want to jump to that, but just during the commercial break, we got the official readout from the Prime Minister's office on his meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump, and there's a key bit of news in there about the acceleration of talks. It says, to that end, the leaders agreed to pursue negotiations toward a deal within the coming 30 days. So, Rob, just your thoughts on that. They said it was accelerated in various scrums. They wouldn't give us a timeline, but here in the readout, 30 days.
Yeah, nothing concentrates the mind of a miscreant like a hanging at noon or a journalist like a deadline in 30 days. And it's, I think this is the two leaders saying, okay, the clock is actually now ticking. It puts pressure on both sides, but welcome news. Welcome news in that it's going to force both governments to bring their biggest guns to the table and to have this discussion in a serious and meticulous way. I actually think it's good news.
Okay, just a quick round on that. Lisa, your thoughts on this? Like, Mark Carney's tried to get a bunch of things done by Canada Day. Maybe now they'll get this done by, Bastille Day, and, to use national holidays. Your thoughts?
Yeah, he's not afraid of giving deadlines, is he? I mean, that is something that politicians tend to stay away from because you can be held to account, quite frankly. So I'm glad to see that there is a time frame that they've put in place. It could be ambitious, consequential events could happen in the meantime, and who knows what's going to end up happening. But it's such a follow the bouncing ball kind of issue, meaning that I don't know whether or not we believe in 30 days we're actually going to have something, because we're dealing with a president who goes in and out of tariffs on 30 days spins like it's no tomorrow. So I'm hopeful, but let's see what brings 30 days.
But, Vandana, putting 30 days in writing and a readout suggests there's an optimism they can get there, right? Or, or that is like the line in the sand time. I mean, how do you read that time frame?
I think Mark Carney doesn't put things on paper like that unless he's very, very, very sure of himself. So I would think that it tells me that probably a lot of the meat of what they want to agree to, they have agreed in principle, and they have to get through some details over the next 30 days. I think when it comes to deadlines, he really believes in the follow through of what politicians say. I know we cannot control Donald Trump. He is very volatile. He's not predictable. But I do think it tells me that he feels very confident in the breadth of what they're talking about, and that it only matters of a few details to carry it through.
Brad, your thoughts?
Well, this is going to call for, I think, some discipline on this front. Knowing that there's a timeline and knowing that there's very likely an agreement coming gives some assurance to the country. Now, what people will do is they'll start attaching that which they wish to see in such an agreement now that there's a framework. So when it's behind closed doors and you don't know, and then all of a sudden we've got a deal and here it is, and everyone goes, yay, now you kind of say, okay, you got 30 days. So look for stakeholders throughout the country, the premiers, mayors of large centers, captains of key sectors of industry to begin to jump in to offer their friendly advice in the public forum as to what the shape and form of such an agreement within this time frame should look like.
David, if I can, one other thing that a 30-day deadline does is I think it will accelerate the Prime Minister's plan, if this goes wrong, to swiftly and with great determination look for other markets. He is quite resolved to do that. If this thing goes sideways, the restructuring begins. It will take years, without a doubt, but it will say, okay, now we must begin. And the pivot away from the United States, which is going to be very, very difficult, begins after 30 days.
I think to add to Rob's point, too,
Yeah,
David,
even in the 30 days. Sorry, Vandana, because he's got like the NATO summit and the EU summit coming up in June.
right.
So sorry, go ahead, Vandana. I didn't mean to talk
just
over
strike
you
when the iron's hot. If they feel like they have a great relationship, if they feel like Donald Trump is confident in the relationship, and he's already saying that while it's a complex idea, he's complimentary of Mark Carney's idea, a deadline is the best way to get it forward. Any amount of time, other things can happen in the world, other things can happen in the U.S., moods can change, and I think he feels like the shorter timeline, the better to get it across.
Okay. Look, Pierre Poilievre's got more than 30 days. He's got until January, so that's like 6-7 months. It's about 210 days. Lisa, what do you make of this? Fred Delory said on the show Friday that he heard it was going to be in Calgary in January, and the leadership review is not the news. That's the mandatory thing that happens after every election. But that's going to be in the conservative heartland, sort of in the, one of the big intellectual, cultural capitals for them in Calgary, and that it's going to happen in 2026. What do you make of those developments coming out of the Conservative Party?
Sure. It's 2 plane rides away from most small towns in the Maritimes. So it's also in Alberta, where a lot of Quebec delegates may not go. You got to be there in person to cast a secret ballot. You can vote. And as well, it's a delegated affair, which means it's not a popular vote. It means that your local electoral district association board, which is probably still held very much by the candidate that just ran and maybe won or lost in the last election, they're going to put forward their slate to go to Calgary. Some will go, some won't go. They're all going to cast ballots. So Calgary in January is very much in favor for an incumbent. But what he's not running against anyone. He's running against a notional number as to what's good enough for him to be able to stick around. And that's the number to watch for. And calling all the failed candidates makes a whole lot of sense, because guess what? They are actually going to be voting at this event in January. So start with them.
Brad, by then also Pierre Poilievre will probably be an Alberta member of Parliament, because the by-election will probably have happened in Battle River Crowfoot. What do you make of this, though? The way he's approaching this, kind of doing it himself, which is not surprising given Mr. Poilievre's leadership style, and the party apparatus sticking it in Calgary for the sort of favor the incumbent, as Lisa just suggested.
Yeah, there's no question that it's going to favor the incumbent for all the reasons Lisa pointed out. So that's done. Phoning through to the failed candidates. I mean, having the leader do kind of his or her own kind of post-mortem, especially when you've got this in a handful of months, probably not a bad idea. Not only because I think leaders should be talking to individuals that lost. You can talk to the winners, and they'll probably say, well, it was because I was such a great personality, and they sent me as much as they were sending a conservative or the leader. But when you talk to the failed candidate, particularly when just 4 or 5 months ago, a lot of these folks that he's talking to were expecting to win because they were 20 points ahead in the polls. Now, more won more conservatives won this time than last time for sure. But the failed candidate. But what it does is it gives the leader the ability, when they do their own postmortem or partial postmortem, is say, that's what I heard. And they begin to be able to set the record straight as to what went wrong. So a lot of people can say, you didn't pivot quick enough, you talked too much about issue X instead of issue Y. But he can say with some credibility, that's not what I heard. I did my own debrief, and this is what I heard. So he gets to help write the history as to what precisely went wrong, as opposed to just handing it off to party apparatus who go off and talk to various aspects of the party. They write the report, and who knows, it could be quite critical, either the leader or the leader's office or key strategic advisors to the leader. But if he does his own, he has a credible way to say, that's not what I heard.
Vandana, do you think that would be credible? Because some of the grumblings you hear from Conservative current MPs and some of the candidates was how centrally controlled everything was, how tightly controlled everything was through the leader. And if your value proposition has been in the aftermath of losing your seat and losing the election that we were this close, if the polls in January suggest you're that far away now, that becomes problematic potentially. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think also, I agree with Brad's point, but I also think the other counter to that is that some people may not want to tell the leader everything, especially because it was so tightly controlled, because it was so central. If, we heard reports of people wanting to run and their nomination was fixed, or there's a preferred candidate or whatnot. So if you tell him exactly how you feel, maybe you don't get to run again. Maybe you don't get, he gets offended. Maybe as much as I would hope he wants to hear it himself, sometimes people won't share exactly what they want to share with him because they may feel that it's tightly controlled and that will ruin my chances to run again. So I don't know if it's always the best way. I think it's important for party apparatus. Now, the only thing I think about is that if Jenny Byrne is still there and maybe there's not a trust for other people, I think you should have other people asking these questions too and put together a report. I think it's good political hygiene in general, whether you win or lose, to do a postmortem. But I do think himself doing it, as much as I think it's good to connect with people, if you're trying to showcase that, yes, that was the problem, please help me understand. But the only thing is he may not get the full information of what he gets.
Yeah, Robbie, I mean, is that stakeholder outreach or is it issues management? I mean, how do you view it?
A little both. My understanding is he's not just talking to defeated candidates, he's talking to people whom he asked to run late in the game, shortly before the campaign, and who turned him down. Partly out of why are you coming to me now? Why didn't you come to me before? He's also probably talking to one or two people who might be considering running against him to try and gauge exactly where they might sit. And right now they're not moving in any hurry. We have to realize that this is relatively uncharted territory for this iteration of the Conservative Party. They haven't had a leadership review until since Stephen Harper in 2004. Because he lost that election. There was a review. There was no way they were going to turn thumbs down on the guy who brought the modern Conservative Party together, created it in essence. This is a little different. This is not Stephen Harper. For the reasons Lisa set out, there is some real, I think, dissatisfaction in Toronto, in Quebec. I would say, I would hazard to say in Atlantic Canada as well. And it is going to be harder to organize from a distance. But I don't rule out that there might be some acrimony there. He is clearly working hard to hang on to his job. This is not a guy who's going to be sitting around sipping Docktails this summer. He's going to be working hard all summer.
So, Lisa, I'm assuming there has to be some other formal, official election post-mortem other than the leader who lost his seat doing it himself, right? I mean, for the party to, party faithful to take it seriously, that a clear-eyed examination of how you lost after being up by 20 to 25 points for a good chunk of time, that can't be something that the leader is completely central to. I mean, can it? It needs to be broader than that.
Yeah. And my memory is failing me now, but I thought that Rick Perkins and Glenn, I can't remember Glenn's last name, sorry, Glenn, out in Calgary were asked to co-chair something that had to do with looking at the election. That would be separate and apart from what the leader's currently doing right now.
Right.
But, I think as Rob pointed out, we are in uncharted territory. I think what the leader is doing is, quite frankly, he's just shoring up support. And I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. What is the number that he needs to hit in order for it to be enough for him to keep his leadership? Maybe he's shooting for 95%, could very well be. But what does that number look like? I mean, Tom Mulcair, what did his number look like? What caused him, Brad, to determine what number it needed to be in order for him to stay on as leader? These are questions that I think will unfold as time goes by. But right now, the way that the cards are dealt, I think they are very much in favor of Mr. Poilievre. And that's fine. And I don't see anyone out there, Rob, trying to mount a campaign against him, to be honest. I don't think anyone's going to overtly run against him. I think should he be running against the numbers.
Should he come back with a Joe Clark 67 or 70%? Do you think that those campaigns would organize very, very quickly? I think they would.
After that, I think they're going to give him a shot at his own leadership race without being polluted by having other people put their hand up. I don't think people are going to put themselves forward as an alternative to him. I think they're going to let him see what he can do in terms of getting the membership. And I'd make the prediction he's going to win the leadership handily.
Yeah. And it'll be about expectation
what's the number,
David.
Lisa? Well,
yeah,
look, he's going to have
you guys will determine that.
Yeah, he's going to have 2 data points. He's going to have the by-election number from Battle River Crowfoot, and he's going to have the leadership number. But does it need to be 75%, 80%, 85%? Yeah. I mean, what's your sense, Lisa, on what conservatives would expect of their leader?
It's a great question, but I would expect he's going to do well above 75%. I don't see him losing his grip on the Conservative Party of Canada whatsoever. And I think the exercise that he's going through right now, listening to people, is going to be the proof in this. He's learned this before when he almost lost his seat in 2019. In 2015, he doubled down and hit every door in his community 4 times before the next election. So
Right.
this is muscle memory for him. He knows what he's doing here.
I think what also
The guy knows how to work hard. There's no question. Quickly, Vonda and Brad, quick thoughts and a number if you got it, because then I got to get to a break.
I think what benefits him too is that there's no leader in the waiting. You know, I mean, Liz Landsman's a very strong leader. I mean, Harper had a very strong bench. You get people like Lisa Raitt, James Moore, and other people who can run for leader. But I don't think we see that the same way. I mean, he has a very, a caucus that seems to believe in him and support him. But there's no person that people are saying like, oh, this would be a really good leader for the Conservative Party of Canada. So I think that benefits him ultimately in terms of how him winning his leadership race or his review.
Okay. Brad, last word to you and a number if you've got it.
Oh, I always got a number, David. Look,
I figured.
In addition to the outreach, look for him to be the softer, kinder, gentler, because I think in the lead up to that January convention, but the number, the incumbent advantage for Lisa's points is gonna help him, unless you really have if you hold him personally responsible for blowing it, which I don't think a lot of Conservatives do, then they're not going to get on a plane, fly all the way to Calgary just to mark yes, I want a leadership. So indifference, they're not going to go to Calgary. It'll just be his fan group, and the people that really, really hate him are going to go, and that I submit that's a very, very small group. His poll numbers are softening. That first number needs to start with a 9 in order, I think, for him, particularly because his by-election number will likely start with an 8 or a 7 for sure. And you just got to show support that it's his party. Then he gets a blank check to run in the next election campaign in 3.5 years.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, we got to leave it there. I appreciate all of your time today. Lisa Raitt, Brad Levine, Vonda Cotter, and Rob Rousseau. Okay, a quick update to a story we talked about a lot on this program. Former Member of Parliament Han Dong has settled his defamation lawsuit with Global News. Global published a story in 2023 alleging Dong told a Chinese diplomat to delay freeing 2 Canadians held in China. Dong denied the allegations, and the final report of the public inquiry into foreign interference says there was intelligence that corroborated Dong's denial. In a statement to CBC News, Dong said, after 2 long years, finally, my family and I can move on. All right, there's still lots more to come here on this special edition of Power and Politics, coming to you live from Banff, Alberta. Up next, we'll talk to someone who worked with U.S. President Donald Trump the last time the G7 was held in Canada, a summit that didn't exactly end well for Canada-U.S. relations. That conversation is coming up next. Well, just last hour, Prime Minister Mark Carney and U.S. President Donald Trump said they are aiming to reach a trade and security deal within 30 days. This news comes after the leaders opened the day with a positive tone.
I think we're going to accomplish a lot, and I expect to. And I think our primary focus will be trade and trade with Canada, and I'm sure we can work something out.
Yep. President Trump is back on Canadian soil for the first time since the 2018 G7 summit in Charlevoix, Quebec. Then he signed the joint communique, but left Charlevoix and blew it up with a tweet from the air, blasting former Prime Minister Trudeau on social media. This year, leaders are not expected to issue a joint statement, and as Canadian officials are hoping to avoid a repeat of the last time. Now, right behind Trump in that famous scene, that photograph, is Everett Eisenstadt. He was Donald Trump's Sherpa at that 2018 summit. He is now a partner at the law firm Squire Patton Boggs, and he joins me now from Washington. Mr. Eisenstadt, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here today, sir.
It's a pleasure, David. Thank you for having me.
So some positive signs in the Canada-U.S. relationship at a G7 in Canada, which is a change from Charlevoix. We heard the president say this morning, I'm sure we can work something out on trade with Canada, and now we see they hope to have an agreement within 30 days, according to the readout from the Prime Minister's office. What's your assessment of how the day has gone there?
No, I think it could not have gone better from the Canadian perspective, and it's good for the United States as well. I mean, it started on a positive tone. I think there's a recognition that there's not going to be complete alignment on all the issues, but the fact that trade is on the agenda, that it's a top topic, that it's a topic that they both agree need to be resolved, and that there's a timeline to do so, I think that's a very positive and good beginning.
We saw a very different dynamic in the conversation, right? They had private meetings that went about an hour, first name basis when they came out of it, a Canada-U.S. pin on the president's lapel that he apparently, or his team, brought. It wasn't a gift from Canada as the host country. All of these things suggest that this is moving in a direction that maybe can hit that 30-day timeline, because you wouldn't put that in writing if you didn't think it was real, I'm guessing.
No, but I mean, it's just the way the president operates. I mean, he's always willing to sit down and negotiate, and this kind of interpersonal dynamic is perfect for resolving these tough problems. He is an individual who really thrives in an environment of a personal negotiation. And one of the things that, we reflect back on the G7 in Charlevoix, and what's forgotten about that meeting because of the aftermath is that generally the meeting went pretty well. There was a communique, there was an agreement. At the end of it, there wasn't, but that was not because of what happened at the time the president was on the ground. It happened because of what happened when he went in the air. So it's a good sign that what's happening today is it appears to be in a good direction, and that's very welcome.
Yeah, I remember, because there was a communique, and then President Trump left to go to Asia for his meeting with the North Korean leader. The Prime Minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, gave a press conference and was critical of the United States on things, but it was things he had said before. But for whatever reason, the president didn't like it this time, and he just sort of rescinded his signature on the communique, more or less, or his endorsement of the communique in the air.
Yes, I totally recall all of that. And it was, I do believe, kind of and I don't know what the president felt or what his reaction was, but I think he had felt like he had really worked hard to accommodate and come to an understanding in the communique. And then as soon as he left, there was some language, about that was critical of him when he had really worked hard to achieve an outcome and had made some concessions on issues that were important. So it was more atmospheric, and it really did set a bad tone, I think, for the relationship that has carried through even to this day, which again goes back to the point about how critical these interpersonal dynamics can be in working with President Trump.
Well, we've seen in the G7 the next year that President Macron hosted, where they didn't try to get a communique because they didn't want to set up sort of an oppositional scenario, between the other countries and the United States on some contentious issues. And we're kind of seeing this here. We've seen Mark Carney publicly flatter the president, on inspiring them all to invest in defense, for example. So they've learned the lessons, I think, of the first term, that sitting down with the president and telling him the multilateral system is a good thing and it works well for the United States, that's not going to work with him. They have to find other ways to deal with Donald Trump in these settings.
Absolutely. And it's also more of an understanding that you need to see the other person's perspective. You may not agree with it. And the reality is that the G7 was a very cohesive unit for quite a long time, where countries could come together, they could agree upon common language. Sometimes these communiques get a little bit out of control. They take on too much. They try to, really reflect everybody's personal political priorities, and you can't do that. So I think sometimes the communiques can be a bit of an obstacle to developing good relations. And we have differences. We have differences. The president has differences on defense, and he has differences on trade. The fact that the leaders are coming in with a recognition of that and willing to understand that and not just try to browbeat or create a dynamic that's going to create cohesion when there may not be clear cohesion is a reflection of the development and the maturity of the relationship, which I believe is a good thing.
Well, what about the flip side of that, though, Mr. Eisenstadt? That if you can't have the difficult conversations and try to reach a consensus on the issues that divide you, it becomes difficult for the 7 biggest democratic economies in the world to take collective action on some of these things, and work together to try to push difficult issues further ahead. I mean, climate is not going to be talked about here beyond wildfires and community safety. It's not going to be about emissions and a climate plan and these sorts of things. So some of these issues, they get pushed to the side at a forum like this now.
Yeah, I think, I understand that point, and I do believe that there are issues for leaders to resolve. I'm not sure the G7's the place to do all that. Sometimes it can take on too much. The reality is there's a lot of important issues on the table right now. For the president, trade is a priority, and he's working hard with these leaders to find a pathway for agreements. And I expect progress to be made. The fact that there's an announcement about a 30-day timeline is part of that progress. We saw earlier there's been some implementation of the U.S.-UK trade agreement that I think is very telling and very positive as well. So perhaps we could have some more dynamics like that. We'll have to wait and see what transpires over the next several days, but it certainly looks like we're off to an interesting and hopefully productive G7 meeting.
Yeah, I just wonder, just as a final point, what's your thoughts on how you view how Mark Carney has managed this relationship with Donald Trump? Because things have been very difficult, obviously, as you can imagine, for the past little while. But they got through the election. They've had some phone calls. The Oval Office meeting happened, and the tone and things have changed. They talk and text, and it was very friendly today. I mean, so far it seems to have worked, but steel and aluminum tariffs have doubled. They've not gone down in that time frame. So how would you assess how it's being managed?
Well, you can't solve everything overnight. It's a very pragmatic approach that seems to be bearing fruit. And, the president's going to be in office for 4 years. He's been in office now for 6 months. We have some of the new dynamics that could be, how people react to them help set the tone of the relationship. So I think that the way that it's been approached is a very pragmatic, problem-solving approach. It's an approach that I think will resonate with the president. And to be candid, we need to find a way to resolve these issues because we are very important trading partners. We may not go back to the type of trading relationship we had, say, 20 years ago, but I do think we'll be able to productively work through these issues and find a good path forward.
Do you think, just as a final point, Everett Eisenstadt, do you think Americans are feeling the pain of this now, too? Because we spoke with the Premier of New Brunswick, who was part of a delegation in Boston meeting with the Northeastern governors. Some of their tourism communities and other sectors are getting walloped by the Canadian boycotts here. I mean, what's your sense of the domestic pain and pressure here to get a settlement on the U.S. side?
There's always going to be, David, it's a really good question. And it's when you've had economies that have developed over a period of time, say 20 years, you accommodate to that reality, right? And so this disruption is painful. And the president even acknowledged that several months ago that some of his policies will cause disruption. And not everyone's going to benefit equally. But at the same time, these are important issues to him. And I think he's willing to, take these on to try to get what he believes will be a fair trading relationship. Now, I'd hope that sentiment about visiting the United States is short-lived. We obviously would love to have more visitors from Canada here, and I've been to Canada, and it's love to visit there as well. So hopefully, we'll work through this, and the pain points will be short-lived, and we'll find a very, very good and productive path forward.
Everett Eisenstadt, it was good to meet you, sir, in Washington. Thank you for joining us today.
David, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, well, still to come here on the show, the latest on the tense situation in the Middle East as Israel and Iran exchanged missile fire for the 4th day in a row. Stay right there. Well, here at the G7 summit in Banff, the leaders are discussing global security with an acute focus on the brewing conflict, the ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel. And today, some extraordinary moments. This was the moment an Israeli attack hit Iran's state broadcaster while it was live on television.
آنچه که ملاحظه کردید، صدایی که شنیدید، فضای غبارآلوده استودیو.
Israel struck the television station today after it warned and told hundreds of thousands of people in a section of Iran's capital to evacuate, and after Iran fired a barrage of new missiles at Israel overnight. Meanwhile, U.S. news outlets are reporting that Israel told the United States about a plan to assassinate Iran's supreme leader, but that President Donald Trump vetoed it. And today, ABC News asked Israel's prime minister about the reports of Trump's objection.
Do you understand his concern? My understanding is his concern is that this would escalate the conflict beyond where it is already.
It's not going to escalate the conflict. It's going to end the conflict.
Okay, Thomas Junot is a professor of public and international affairs at the University of Ottawa, and he joins me now. Thomas, these U.S. reports, not denied there by Benjamin Netanyahu, why would Israel have looked at assassinating the Ayatollah at this point?
Well, Israel has been engaged in a campaign of assassinations against its enemies now for about 18 months, ever since the series of wars that followed the Hamas attacks in October 2023. And from Israel's perspective, it's been very successful. Israel, as we know, assassinated not only the Secretary General of Hezbollah in Lebanon, but several layers of its leadership. Same with Hamas. It also tried with the Houthis, so far with limited success. And now, in the past 5 days or so since this operation against Iran started, we know that Israel assassinated a number of key leaders in the nuclear program. It assassinated a number of senior military officials, including very senior military officials. So from Israel's perspective, these assassinations work. They have succeeded in significantly weakening its enemies. So going after the supreme leader of Iran, who is the most powerful individual in the country, it's not the president, would have been basically the culmination of this strategy.
Okay, Thomas, as we are speaking, Donald Trump has just posted on Truth Social, where a lot of American policy and foreign policy gets made. And he says, Iran should have signed the deal I told them to sign. What a shame and waste of human life. Simply stated, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. I said it over and over again. And this last line is what jumps out. Everyone should immediately evacuate Tehran. I mean, what do you think that could possibly mean with what we've seen so far at this point?
Very hard to say, because I am long past the point of trying to understand what exactly President Trump means when he says things on social media. Clearly, that could be interpreted as a threat to target civilian infrastructure in Tehran, which would be a war crime by any reasonable indicator. That being said, there are a number of military installations, nuclear sites in Tehran that Israel has already been targeting. But keep in mind that Tehran is a city of many million people, and evacuating that city is just not possible in the short term. So it could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, that's about 10 million people in Tehran, so I don't know how they could do that immediately, but, you know, they have been trying to get hundreds of thousands of people to move out of specific areas, and just discuss that in a second, but just to go back to the idea of assassinating the Ayatollah, what would that do? Would that weaken Iran significantly more than taking out the military leaders, which Israel has been focused on to this point? I mean, would that inflame things? The allies, as you've outlined, are, you know, the proxies are weakened and eroded. What could happen if the Ayatollah had been assassinated, killed, targeted by the IDF?
So there's a big debate among experts in government, in academia, on what does assassination mean? Does it work? And it's not clear that it always does. We've looked a lot, for example, at assassination of leaders of terrorist groups. And the risk, of course, is always that the leader that is assassinated will be replaced by a more competent leader, by a more extremist leader, which can actually make things worse. However, the counter-argument is, A, there's the possibility that the leader will be replaced by a weaker leader, which is what we're seeing in Iran 5 years after the assassination of General Soleimani. If you remember, in January 2020, his successor has been a weaker leader, and that has worked to weaken Iran. In addition, what we've seen with Hezbollah and Hamas in particular is that several layers of leadership have been assassinated by Israel, and that undoubtedly weakens an organization. As much as Hezbollah or Iran, they have contingency plans, they have deep benches of talent. At some point, when so many leaders are assassinated, it will paralyze the organization, it will freeze decision making, and it will weaken it, at least in the short to midterm. You know,
just to go back to the targeting of the targets inside the capital of Tehran. They told hundreds of thousands of people to get out before the president's latest statement telling everyone to get out. And then they hit the television station, the state broadcasters we just showed there off the top of this segment. I mean, what does that tell you about this approach to the conflict that's happening now?
So what we're broadly seeing now, after about 5 days of Israeli strikes on Iran, is that there are 3 buckets of targets that Israel has been hitting. The obvious ones are the nuclear program. Israel has hit a lot of nuclear sites, research site, enrichment sites, a variety of sites. 2, Israel has been hitting military sites very hard, military bases, air defenses, missile production sites, missile launch sites, and this is having a very costly impact on Iran's military capability. Third, what we've really seen, especially since the weekend, Sunday in particular, is Israel hitting economic targets and especially oil infrastructure. Iran is a big oil producer. Its economy is very reliant on oil, and this is having and will have an increasingly strong economic impact on Iran. Now, what I'm still waiting to come to any kind of definitive conclusion, but it's the suggestion that beyond these 3 categories, Israel might also be hitting broader government sites, such as the public broadcaster, which plays a very important role in the information operations and the propaganda by the Iranian government. I'm still withholding judgment on that one, but there seems to be a trend of this 4th category of targets.
Okay, so just to bring it back to the G7 for a second, Tomas, a final point. CBS, the New York Times, they're reporting today that Trump isn't keen or isn't planning to sign on to a joint statement, calling for de-escalation in the region. As we understand it, from what we're hearing here, is that it would be a support for Israel's right to defend itself, but a call for de-escalation in the conflict, and a statement that there's no way Iran can develop a nuclear program. If the U.S. can't get on board with that, stays out of it, here at the G7, I mean, what do you think it takes to stop this from becoming a protracted and maybe escalating war? Do you think there is an intervention that can stop it without the U.S.?
No. I mean, the only actor that can have any kind of influence on Israel's calculus is the United States. Whatever happens at the G7, at the European Union, at NATO, in Canada, or anywhere else will not have any kind of influence on Israel. For now, Israel has been very clear that it wants this operation to continue, at least for several days, possibly for a number of weeks. And really, it's important to understand how much of a window Israel perceives. Iran has been significantly weakened. Right now, Israel has maybe not complete control, but at least significant control of Iranian airspace, right? Israeli planes and drones can operate over Iran with very little danger, at least over significant parts of Iran. So Israel has been very clear that it wants to exploit that window of opportunity. Nobody is going to prevent it from doing that, except at some point the U.S. But for now, my understanding is that the U.S. is not sending a signal of restraint to Israel. So ultimately, this is going to continue either until Israel figures that it has weakened Iran enough, or until the U.S. Really starts pressuring Israel. But we are not at that point yet.
Okay, Tomas Junot, always appreciate the time. That's Tomas Junot with the University of Ottawa. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to return to our top story, a day of high-level meetings as G7 leaders gather here in Alberta to discuss trade, tariffs, and global security.
I think we're going to accomplish a lot, and I expect to. And I think our primary focus will be trade and trade with Canada, and I'm sure we can work something out.
Our panel of journalists who've been covering the day's events, Louis, Katie, Weary, they're here with me. Next. Prime Minister Mark Carney began the day talking trade with U.S. President Donald Trump.
I'm a tariff person. I've always been a tariff. It's simple, it's easy, it's precise, and it just goes very quickly. And I think Mark has a more complex idea, but also very good. So we're going to look at both, and we're going to see what we're going to come out with something. Hopefully.
Mr. President, do you think a deal is achievable within days, within weeks? Is there that kind of runway?
Yeah, it's achievable. Both parties have to agree. Yeah, sure.
Now, while that meeting did not result in a trade deal, Canadian officials did leave with the promise of more meetings to try to solve this costly tariff war.
We feel a sense of acceleration in the discussions in the last couple of weeks, and that is a very good thing.
We collectively think we're making progress and coming to a deal that would be in the economic interest of both countries, but we're not there yet, and that's why we reconvened after the meeting with the President and the Prime Minister, and we agreed to reconvene before the end of this week again.
Okay, just last hour, the Prime Minister's office said the leaders set a goal of negotiating a deal within 30 days. Some big news there. So I'm going to bring in our panel of CBC journalists who've been covering the summit with me. Katie Simpson is a senior reporter. She's usually in Washington, but she's here live in person. Louis Blouin is the parliamentary bureau chief for Radio Canada. And Aaron Weary is a senior writer for the CBC's parliamentary bureau. Okay, Aaron, let's start with you. I mean, we were told there was progress, acceleration, and then boom, 30 days comes out. We learned that within a month they're going to try to get it done.
Turns out that there's a lot of progress, or at least enough progress to make it think that they can get something done in 30 days. I mean, I think it seemed positive right off the start, the fact that they spoke one-on-one, the fact that the one-on-one meeting and the full bilateral went for, I believe, about over 70 minutes. So it seemed like there was, a decent start. We can get into maybe later the discussion when it was on camera. But at least on the trade front, it seems like things are moving in the right direction. I think you still have to ask yourself, what exactly are they going to get to in 30 days? And what exactly does a deal look like? Are we talking about an actual deal? Are we talking about an agreement to get to an agreement? And are we talking about something where there aren't going to be tariffs?
Right. Well, Louis, I think one thing we can say for sure is that in 30 days, we're going to get to mid-July. Beyond that, I have no idea. But, the fact that Mark Carney is willing to put a timeline in writing, that is new here and feels significant. What's your view on it?
I think he needed a line drawn in the sand, David, just to say at one point, there's a limit where we're going to be able to go. Canadians might run out of patience at some point, and I think Mark Carney needed to
Okay, Louis, I'm going to stop you there. You're coming in garbled. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if that's just the earpieces here on the set or if that's going out over. Sorry, Louis. We want to hear what you have to say, so I got to figure that out. So while we do that, just Katie, your thoughts on this, the fact that there's a 30-day timeline now in public.
Oh, given how unpredictable this is, and I feel like, David, whenever I come on this program, I feel like unpredictable is sort of like the baseline of the hit that we are talking about. But given the fact that Mark Carney is willing to put a date in writing, because it's a pass or fail, right? They're either going to achieve this or not achieve this. And so it's a clear marker, an indicator of progress where either the Prime Minister and the President reached a goal or did not. Right. It's also in line sort of what the Prime Minister said in that statement is it's also sort of in line with what Trump suggested. I felt like it was a sense of like non-committal optimism from Donald Trump. He's committed to tariffs. He sees himself as the tariff person, as he says, but he also didn't rule out, being able to reach an agreement. He says, listen, we got to be able to get there, that kind of thing. We asked him whether it would be, possible within days or weeks. And he said, yeah, it is, something that we could achieve, but, the both sides have to get to a place where they agree. Right. What we know right now where they don't agree is the sticking point of tariffs. Mm-hmm. That's a non-starter for Canada. And we heard from the ambassador who said that, we are negotiating for a position of no tariffs. One thing, David, your interview with Ambassador Hillman that stood out for me was something that she said about what she hopes that the president's team takes away from it. Because even though the decision is going to be ultimately made by Donald Trump, what we are hearing about what's going on behind the scenes is, one member of the Trump administration is saying, well, we need to address this issue or this issue. And it's kind of a whole bunch of different things are coming up, like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that kind of progress. And the way that Ambassador Hillman sort of said, hopefully, Trump saying that this is something that is achievable within days or weeks, that's a message that his team gets.
That's true. Okay, Louis, my apologies. Apparently on the broadcast, your audio is just fine, but coming into my head, it is garbled and distorted. So that's why I interrupted you there. But the nation wants to hear what you have to say. So please, your thoughts on the 30-day timeline.
Yes, I think I was saying that I think Mark Carney needs a line drawn in the sand. I think he needed a target also to be able to say to Canadians, okay, here's when maybe my patience runs out. Because at some point, Donald Trump raised his tariff to 25 to 50% on steel, on aluminum. Canada will have to react at some point. So how long do you give space to negotiation? How long do you say, okay, you know what, we need to get a deal before that date? And I think that was important for Mark Carney to set that, because what we see now is just the Prime Minister being very nice with Donald Trump, wishing him happy birthday, saying he wants to participate in his Golden Dome. He has a new bill to secure the border. But at one point, you cannot just give. You need to get something back. And I think he really needed that finish line, and a true finish line, I think, because I don't think it would be credible for him after that deadline to say, oh, you know what, maybe we can try another 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Like, at some point, you have to say, okay, you know what, if we can't agree on this, we need to get the hammer down.
Okay, Louis, I heard every word of that, so that was excellent, audio and content-wise. So, Aaron, on that, when the tariffs doubled on steel and aluminum, the Prime Minister said, "Look, this is not directed at Canada. We're in delicate talks." Is this 30 days, the time when the patience starts to run out, as he continues to do other things like deepen alliances with Europe at a bunch of summits this month?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's one or the other. I mean, I take it from Mark Carney's comments that he does sort of see this as both solving the relationship with the United States, but also deepening ties with other countries, particularly Europe. I do think, Mark Carney has faced questions about when he would retaliate, if he would retaliate for the latest round of tariffs. And I do think that at some point, I think his argument has been, well, it looks like we're showing progress. It looks like I see progress happening, so we're not going to kind of get in front of that. I think at some point, to Louis' point, patience runs out and you have to respond. And so these 30 days does kind of fix attention on getting to something. Although I'll return to my previous point, I would still like to know exactly what we're going to get to.
Well, look, I think everybody would like to know that. But, Katie, the Donald Trump interaction, the public part of the meeting we saw today, that is different than what we're used to seeing with the Canadian Prime Minister, and this president in particular is even more calm and more friendly than what we saw in the Oval Office in May.
Well, here's the thing. I thought there was a nervous energy to start there, and when they sort of were standing there and everyone was sort of standing in the room because the stakes are so high. There's so much here that Canada needs, and how badly Canada needs this to get better, because it has just devastating consequences for the economy. Businesses can't make decisions about investment. Canadian jobs are on the line. There is so much at stake in maintaining this relationship. And so the sense I got, and it's something that I think you picked up on when you were in the Oval Office during the Carney meeting, is that the Canadians were trying to sort of look as if they were calm, but there was a bit of nerve there. It seemed that to me. The other thing that I sort of paid attention to is there were a couple of moments in the public part of the meeting where Donald Trump was saying incorrectly that Justin Trudeau was involved in having Russia removed from the G8. It happened during Prime Minister Stephen Harper's time in office.
2014.
And so when that kept coming up, it came up several times. I kept looking at the Canadian delegation, looking at Mark Carney, looking at their faces. Are they looking at each other? Are they? Because they would know that is factually incorrect. No one blinked. No one moved. Everyone just politely just let that go, because what good does it serve?
There's no upside in litigating.
No upside to bring that up. Absolutely not. And just let if that's the baggage that Trudeau's got, that Trump is associating with him, they're just going to let that go. But I looked to see if anyone sort of looked or flinched or nope, nothing. So it was that sort of like, just stay calm, stay cool. But there was a sense sort of nerve, because, again, you don't know how these things are going to go with Donald Trump. And that's just the nature of these meetings right now.
Yeah. Okay, Louis, I'm going to come to you one more time because we know we got to let you go, because you do work for that other public broadcasting network and you have duties with them. Just your thoughts on the optimism on the Canadian side, right? This nervous tension that Katie talks about, but the deadline is there. They are moving and making some progress, it seems, and it isn't blowing up. They're all staying silent. So what does that tell us about the hopes of this 30 days being fruitful, and how optimistic the Canadian officials are?
I think they really want it to work because it's probably the last window they have to get an agreement in the short term. Because if they don't agree, they might have to wait next year to the renegotiation of the free trade deal. But today it was interesting because they were talking about progress, they were talking about acceleration of the discussions, but also they don't want it to get into the details. They don't want to piss off Donald Trump, that's for sure. But I find that the main gap remains is that Donald Trump still thinks tariffs are the best option. He says it's simple, it's easy, it's very efficient. So it seems to me that Donald Trump still needs to be convinced that his recipe is not the good one. And he's talking about the complex solution of Mark Carney. We don't exactly know what it all entails, but it shows that the president, the man himself, needs to be convinced that tariffs is not the way to go, but it's kind of a religion for him. So how do you have him to step down from that theory or that principle that he have? And this is not done yet. And honestly, we'll see where it goes. And especially is all the advisors around him have different requests, and it goes in all the directions. It is not helping. So I can't wait to see if there's going to be some movement. But one encouraging thing, he has still a good tone. The tone of the discussion is good, and the relation seems to be good still with Mark Carney. Now it needs to translate in results.
Okay, Louis, Radio-Canada's Ottawa Bureau Chief here in Banff. We got to let you go there because you got to go do work with Radio-Canada. Appreciate it. Louis Bloin joining us there. And, you know, Aaron on his way out the door adding another P to PMP when saying they don't want to pee off Donald Trump. And that's definitely the strategy that's at play here. And the not talking about details, not talking about anything about process and overall mood. That's key, right? Because, you know, in negotiations, if they're not talking about what's happening at the table, it usually means things are going okay at the table.
Yeah, I think their approach has been to not give any fodder to, you know, some kind of public debate or falling out. You know, the Trudeau PMO was always kind of trying to avoid a tweet. I think there's a bit of that you're seeing now in trying to avoid a further blow up. I think to Katie's point, the not jumping on the Russia thing, I think is sort of a good example of the difference. You know, if you go back to 2018, Trump came up here, to Charlevoix in that case, wanting to talk about Russia, suggesting Russia should be back in, and Trudeau's PMO decided they were going to take it. Trudeau decided at that G7 to sort of take that issue on directly with Trump around the table. And in this case, you're seeing Mark Carney say, you know what, I'm just going to let Donald Trump talk here in front of the reporters. I'm not going to try to get into a big debate about it. Yeah. And I think that kind of goes to the way Carney seems to be approaching this G7, which is, you know, we're not going to use this to try to send a message to the United States. We're not going to try to send a message to the world that we're reining the United States in. We're going to try to find points of common interest, common views, and move forward with that, and skip things like climate change, for instance, that are potentially going to cause problems.
Well, yeah, Katie, it's all sort of being managed not to put Donald Trump on the opposite side of the table from everybody else, like that image of him and Angela Merkel from Charlevoix. But also, Carney is so central, the Prime Minister is, to the details of this, of the negotiations, talking and texting to Donald Trump. He's been really clear on trying to have a one messenger, one message approach on the Canada-U.S. file, and we've kind of seen that play out today, right?
Yeah, and the fact that we learned, you know, a few hours after the meeting that there had been this development, which is when it comes to these kinds of things, to set a timeline like this, that is a significant development.
30 days that the ambassador and the minister couldn't tell us about.
Yeah,
right?
and just think of how quickly this afternoon unfolded, and then, okay, they're comfortable with putting that out there. One other thing we should keep in mind about that sort of timeline, it's sort of in and around the same timeline Trump is going to be facing a number of other sort of dealing with self-imposed timelines to reach trade deals with other countries. Yeah. It's in sort of that sort of sweet spot there. Donald Trump on his so-called Liberation Day, when he announced his sort of tariff plan for all of these different countries, he had set, he delayed the tariffs and said, okay, we're going to renegotiate in 90 days. Well, that's early July. So it's sort of going to be, July is going to be trade deal month. And, you know, the White House keeps saying week after week, they're coming, they're going to be coming by the dozens. We haven't seen that just yet, but time is getting closer. And so that pressure is building on Donald Trump to actually deliver on some of those things he promised. But Trump, I will say himself, is sort of giving himself a little bit of distance, giving himself a bit of an out. He said, well, you know what, if we can't reach the deals, we'll just tell them what the tariff is. And if they want to do business with us, well, that's the price of business. So, you know, it's July is going to be a very big crunch month when it comes to global trade. But again, now that Canada's sort of in this time frame zone as well, there's that added element to this for Canada.
Aaron, we've got about 90 seconds left. I mean, Trump still says he's a tariff person. we heard from the ambassador, our goal is no tariffs.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there's a world where you have no tariffs on Canada, but Trump can be a tariff person outside of North America, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe that's what the offer that Canada is potentially making. I mean, we don't know exactly the details, but I did think, Ambassador Hillman in her scrum, made this point that, for Donald Trump, he thinks it makes a lot of sense to have a tariff. For Canada, we think it doesn't make a lot of sense for there to be a tariff on Canada. And so it's not clear to me how you solve necessarily those two issues. And I do wonder whether we end up in a situation where there is a deal, but there is still some kind of tariff on Canada, and how that plays out in the public eye.
Yeah, like even the reprieve, we saw that there's a tariff unless you're compliant with the USMCA, and then you get around the tariff, which is the whole point of a trade deal to begin with. Look, anyone thought there's going to be a slow July? Yeah, good luck. All right. We already said goodbye to Louis. We've got to say goodbye to Katie Simpson and Aaron Weary. They're going to be around tomorrow, though, because there's going to be a lot of news happening tomorrow here at the G7 in Banff, Alberta. I'm David Cochrane. Thanks to our panelists. Thank you for watching Power and Politics. We'll be back in Banff tomorrow for the final day of this G7 summit. Hannah Mansing tonight is up next here on CBC News Network. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.